Well, hello and thank you for joining me for another Alex on Tech and iTWire TV interview. I'm joined today by Aaron Bugal. He is the Global Cybersecurity Solutions Enabler at Sophos. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
So look, I see from your LinkedIn profile that you've been with Sophos for an impressive 14 years. So what sparked your interest in cybersecurity?
It was very much all a natural progression for me. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I started at Sophos, I was well entrenched into the security mindset, thinking about all things security. Well, as much as you could think about back then,
Mm.
a lot of it was floppy disk encryption
Yeah,
still, and a little bit of antivirus and firewalls were just becoming pretty standard in most organizations, if not at just like a level 2, layer 3 style thing.
that
But
was when McAfee was still actually running his own security company.
That's very true. Yeah, back in the olden days,
Yeah,
but
that's right.
perhaps. And
Yeah.
15 years is a long time in security, right? And I've seen many moons come and go, and some very interesting things happen. And even before my time at Sophos, just sort of catching that bug as being an IT generalist and tech support person, and then just getting caught on that security train. And it was wireless IDS, and then AV and encryption, and here we are, 2020, and it's been such an interesting year, and still not a day goes by where somebody doesn't get hacked and something really bad's not happening in the criminal underworld, right?
Yeah. Now, I was thinking more during your, I don't know, childhood or teenage years when John McAfee was still running McAfee. I think perhaps by 2005 he may already have sold on and started other adventures. But clearly we've had quite a few amazing years of all sorts of incredible security things and technological advancements. But, you've just released the 2021 threat report, which
Hmm.
acknowledges that the level of threats that have emerged are targeting everyone that has had to work from home. We have heard of that a lot this year, whilst obviously ransomware continues being an ever more dangerous threat. So what are some of the things that report really highlighted? What are some of the things you want to draw out and we can talk about?
Yeah, I guess a couple of the things that really stood out in the research that our organization did in regards to everything that they've seen in this year that's gone by is
Mm,
a couple of things that cyber criminals are starting to really get their act together.
mm,
They're actually starting to coordinate their efforts and come together, sharing tools, tactics, techniques, and procedures between them to become a lot more, I guess, ready to attack their victims. So we won't see a lot of cyber criminals acting on their own. To some extent, their objectives and I guess the loot that they're taking is going to be exclusively for them. But there's some sort of mutual agreement, almost sort of like a little unspoken agreement, if you will, that they'll work together for their own greater bad, as it would seem. So much like Sophos and a lot of the other cybersecurity vendors out there, we do get together and share information and intelligence on threat actors, tools, pieces of malware, bad code, novel techniques using native operating system applications that are being used in attacks, just so that we're all well prepared and we can
mm.
go best defense when it comes to our customers and our partners network. So that was probably one of the more scariest things, that those cyber criminals are starting to talk and share information.
Yeah, they're forming cartels like the traditional criminal underworld has done for decades.
Exactly. That was the word that I was feverishly searching for, which was cartel-like behavior, Alex. So
Yeah, yeah.
thanks for bringing that up, because it is mentioned in the report, and you're right. Like crimes of old, like organized crime,
Mm,
extortion, which is another point in the threat report. They're all sort of having a bit of a renaissance in the digital cyber age. So
mm.
that was one of the other big things that I've seen this year, is that ransomware has persisted, and it has caused a lot of headache for a lot of organizations out there. But the primary focus of a lot of these criminal organizations is to extort their victim organizations by holding exfiltrated data over their head, saying
Mm.
you will pay us this ransom, not because we've encrypted your systems, but because we're going to release your intellectual property to the world, or
Yeah.
your customer information, or if you're a health provider, the ailments of all your patients in your hospital for the last n number of years, which is quite shocking and a little bit scary at the same time for those victims that are being threatened.
It also makes me think that I haven't heard of any sort of classic mafia-like behavior where the bad guys say, "Listen, we're going to protect you from all this ransomware and the bad guys, but you've got to pay us protection money." So that I mean, I don't want to give them any ideas, right? That's probably the next thing they're going to do.
Yeah, touch wood, right?
Yeah.
So, you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if, in the next, couple of years or something like that, we would see that sort of activity, and to an extent, it's already happening now. Where, on the other side of the threat landscape, there's a lot of scamming and phishing still going about, and some of it is exactly that. There's like a guardian angel that's watching over you, who suddenly just informed you that there's a problem with your computer or your network,
Well,
and
that's
for a
right.
small fee, they'll fix that problem and make it go away. So
Mm.
kind of sort of like, a standover tactic,
Yeah.
but unfortunately just preying on those people that may not have the necessary skills in information security and cybersecurity to sort of catch on that it's actually a scam, and they will unwillingly, pay the money in the thought process that they'll get some form of added protection or stop a threat from coming in. So to an extent, as I said, it's already happening, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that was a tactic that they'd sort of ramped up in the future.
Sure. I mean, the FTC in the US was warning that Apple was being impersonated in phone calls. That people were getting calls from Apple. I mean, in the past it was Microsoft or the ATO or Telstra or whoever it might be. I mean, at least in the old days, and I've never been the victim of mafia standover tactics, but at least in the old days when you paid the money, in theory they did protect you. But these
Yeah,
guys, when you're paying the money, then they're not protecting you. I mean,
there
they
was
could be loading other malware on your computer and causing bigger problems, and then trying to extract more money from you.
exactly. And again, in our threat report that we had this year, I mean, we look at 2020, and the thing that dominated the news headlines, which was the pandemic, coronavirus, COVID-19, nCoV, SARS-2, all those keywords and phrases, they were lures to being sent out to individuals with information about how to not catch COVID, or miracle cures to sort of like help defend against catching COVID, or if you think you're going to be threatened with like your livelihood from COVID. So all of these things were just another lure from the fishers action set. So they just prying on the unsuspecting victims to say, well, here's some information, and people gobbling it up.
Yeah.
Fear is a big, conveyor of action. So a lot of people were being driven out of fear and uncertainty about what COVID meant, and were pretty much all clicking on anything that arrived in their inboxes. And from our own research, we saw hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new domains and phishing attacks being launched using COVID, in the early part of this year, and it's sustained all the way through. It's dropped off a little bit now, of course, but it's still a big issue, and people are curious, are fearful, are scared that they're clicking on things that they probably shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, and we also hear about the bad guys trying to attack some of the COVID vaccine rollouts, and also trying to steal that vaccine information. But look, in the report itself, I mean, there was a lot of topics covered. We talked about the ransomware cartels. There were canaries in the coal mine, attacking Windows and Linux servers, and how not to underestimate commodity malware, delivery mechanisms, RDP becoming the number one attack vector for ransomware, how COVID has changed cybersecurity, which we just spoke a little bit about, the pandemic's effect on the nature and impact of cyber attacks, which we just spoke a bit about, cloud security, and how you've got to have that sort of least permission so that you reduce the attack vector. Verizon had a report from 2020 talking about how people's cloud accounts were being targeted because they could give access to a lot of information. And the report talks about accelerated cloud-based attacks and how to stop them, non-traditional platforms, and new vectors in 2020 as hackers discover new ways to get at your data. So there's a lot there. Which one of those do you want to talk about next?
Gee, where do I start? There's so much. It's
Well,
like a
it's
choose your
incredible, yeah. How
choose your own
clever
adventure.
those guys are, and how clever the security companies like yourselves have to be to sort of stay one step ahead and react as quickly as possible. Be proactive as well.
Yeah, and that's it's a really important thing there is being proactive of your own environment. Like if you're a small business, if you're a single person organization just starting out with an idea, or if you're a multinational massive organization like those that have been established for a long time, we've all got to do, in my opinion, the basics, and we've got to do them better when it comes to cybersecurity. A lot of organizations and people are running to newfangled tools and whatnot to help them avoid being the victim of a compromise. But case in point, a lot of the investigations that we've performed with our own rapid response team have found that if things like a better password was chosen, or multi-factor authentication was enabled, or hell, if say patches were deployed to applications or devices that they use daily, that would have really reduced the surface area of attack. So, I mean, some of the advice that we dole out is there's extensive advice that we give, but a lot of it is like basic cyber hygiene. But things that I would love to touch on are cloud security. I mean,
Great.
if anything this year hasn't pushed is the digital transformation of a lot of businesses, and the I guess the automatic adoption of the cloud, where previously organizations or users might have been resistant at going into, say, like a Office 365, Google Docs, or using any sort of like third party
Dropbox.
platform or app. Yeah, exactly right. And they've all of a sudden been thrust into their home office environment, sit on a new setup. They've got a new chair, a new monitor, and their different computer at home, and they're now in a network that is not owned and operated by the organization. So there's a whole extra surface area of attack and opportunity available to these hackers that are out there. So natively using the cloud to get access to information and systems that otherwise would have been behind four walls and a firewall. A lot of people have got this stuff deployed so that their users can work, but the security of those systems hasn't been adequately turned on or enabled or even reviewed or understood in the first place. And that's caused a few people to come very quickly unstuck, forgetting to lock down buckets of data, quite literally, and then having those exposed to the internet, or poor password practices and recycling passwords from, say, their social media accounts, which have been previously breached, and then giving the attackers the ability to walk into a cloud-based environment like they own the place. That's probably been some of the more alarming trends that we've seen. So, with the adoption of this new technology that it is on offer, I said absolutely dive headfirst into it, because it's going to make things oh so easier. But at the same time, there is an equal expectation that there is an ownership of the security of that cloud platform on the user itself. So just don't assume you're using the cloud and whatever it may be, that same level of security, whether or not you own it on premise, is going to be enforced. There's a lot of expectation on the actual user to ensure that the adequate security of that data, that service, whatever it may be, is locked up as good as it can be before, the criminals can get to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure for a lot of companies, the IT departments would be sort of used to by now having to check a lot of computers in the home. But I'm sure at the beginning, and perhaps even still today, there were people being breached not through their own computers, which could have been highly secured with VPNs and all the rest, but through the computers of their partners and children who maybe weren't as widely secured. And the bad guys will think of any nook and cranny to get into to try and break into some very valuable amounts of data out there.
Yeah, you're spot on there, and that's probably what we've seen a big rise on, like the lateral movement within an environment. So, and supply chain is a really good example of this, where you might have a nation state hacker, or maybe it's just a really bored script kiddie sitting at home, and they want to gain access to an environment or a system, but it might be well secured. They'll go look for a business partner or a supplier in that link to say, if they can infiltrate a supplier, then maybe that supply, being a natively trusted entity to that organization, will then allow that piece of malware or that piece of code to get in. So it's pretty typical for us to see like supply chain operators as part of a big process become compromised, and then that implicit trust that's already established between the consumer of that supply chain operator. For example, they might be manufacturing a small part for a larger car manufacturing process. That small car part operator will become compromised. Maybe their email account is taken over through business email compromise. Then a whole bunch of malicious documents are sent up to the car manufacturer saying, hey, we've got these new plans for you to review, and this new part for you probably could, optimize your build process. Just open it up in your favorite browser of choice and let us know what you think. And unfortunately, it's a loaded document. It's got some bad code in it. and then all of a sudden that piece of code has infected that organization from the inside out. And that's pretty typical to what we see. So again, if you're running an organization and you have any form of business to business style of communications, you rely on others to supply you goods and services, is ensure that there's some sort of level of trust there, or sanitization, especially stuff that's coming in from them. What sort of process does it go through to be evaluated and checked? Do you just implicitly trust everything that they give you and say, or is there some sort of level of, checks and balance that you put over it to ensure that if something does come in, if it doesn't look or smell right, what happens with it? What's the process? So just like a lot of organizations these days, ensure that large financial transactions have got multiple signatures. We want to be doing the same thing with anything that comes in digitally that we've been asked to review. It's just getting to that point in time now.
Sure. And is that what you've just described, presumably targeting some sort of zero-day vulnerability in a word processor or a browser or something? Is that one of the ways that ransomware is it's getting in through defenses? I mean, I think every day this week, just about, I've heard of some massive corporation being affected by ransomware. And you would have imagined in 2020 that the security companies and the companies would have figured out how to prevent that, but obviously they haven't. I mean, what's the short version of why that's still a problem in 2020?
Yeah, so think of ransomware as sort of like, if you look at something called the cyber threat kill chain, it's the last blip in the radar before it all goes to water for an organization. So a piece of ransomware is when an attacker goes overt. They spring out from their hidey hole and they deploy a lot of the bad code into an environment. And that's when the organization that's victim goes, gee, something is really wrong with our network. What's wrong? It's all the steps that lead up to that point in time where the attacker has been dwelling, looking for information, exfiltrating data, or trying to find additional ways to cause maximum amount of impact. That there are a whole bunch of other pieces of malware and code and reverse shells and activity that they've been conducting to then get to that point where they're confident that if they release ransomware, they're going to get some return on it. So from my perspective, ransomware will always be an issue for an organization. It's just that if that's the first and last time that you detect something is going wrong in your environment, there are a lot of steps before that have happened that you were unaware and you did not know were happening in your environment that could have allowed you to avoid certain disasters. So that really and easily highlights to me that there's a level of unknown, but a needed level of visibility that those organizations should be employing, whether it's additional security controls, reviewing of their logs. You keep logs for a reason, right? Look at them. Or commissioning a service to actually do that for you, like a managed threat response service, to ensure that activities that are going on, a trained eye can actually see what's going on and interpret that, that activity, that's a precursor to something really bad happening. Let's neutralize that threat before it actually becomes ransomware and your whole organization is locked out and now you've been asked for $34 million in ransom, which is a story that's unfolding today.
Yeah. Well, I imagine that when a company comes to Sophos and says, look, we need your help to secure us, you must start off by doing a complete audit of everything that they've got, so that you can identify what attempts may have already been made and sort of establish, all the areas that they haven't patched. This is out of date, and you must be able to present them and say, look, here's all the things we need to do. Here's the level of insecurity you are at. Good thing you contacted us because we need to get working on this straight away.
Yeah, and you know what, the term audit has some specific connotations in it, right? And audit sort of means exhaustive and long-winded and so forth, which we can do to some extent, but you'll be probably maybe unsurprised by, you go into an organization and it's like drawing a spiral. You put a dot on a piece of paper and you start going around and around and around. And it's those little tiny circles that are the easiest to do. You'll find so many things in an environment, if you start looking for them specifically, that are part of that initial spiral where you're going, that's a problem. Everybody's got domain administrative accounts. That's what they use to log into their laptops with on date. Well, that shouldn't happen. Or you've got these applications deployed which are unpatched, and who manages the updates of them? The user? That should be done on a corporate level, and some sort of trust should be disposed of. If they don't update those applications, they should be booted off the network. So little things like that, just the cyber hygiene, as we call it, the things that should be done are often missed. And they're the things that sort of lead to these big fishes being torn into their environment and information being extracted out quite easily. So get the basics right, and sort of like some of the as I said, some of the recommendations that we make is just get the simple things right, and you'll find that everything else, those bigger circles in your spiral, you'll be able to tackle it a lot easier.
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, I'm just assuming that some companies would come to you and say, "Help us do this," I mean, or help our IT security staff to give us the list to make sure that we really are doing this, because we have to report back to the board that we've done all this and crossed all the, T's and dotted all the I's, because that company doesn't want to become the next victim of some sort of ransomware. And I mean, it's that old thing about how people used to see the IT division as an IT division, but really in the 21st century, the entire company is IT. The entire company is technology based these days. And I mean, if you don't think that way, then you could get a surprise that could shut the company down, which nobody wants.
You've make a really good point there, Alex, is that, IT and probably specific to our conversation today, that cybersecurity is everybody's business. Whereas, the workers are the people that are literally on the front line when it comes to receiving emails, and, are those emails from legitimate sources, and, are they, maybe an attack, a phishing attack on a user to get them to do something to allow an attacker to come in. So I really feel that, the IT department of old is long gone. And I think if you're going to be running an organization, and anybody's going to be using a computer or an iPad or whatever the new piece of technology is going to be, there's going to be a requirement of having some form of cybersecurity, digital security around that tech. So as a user of that tech, as a supplier of that tech, a supporter of that tech, or even a vendor of that tech, there needs to be some form of security story or control that can be wrapped around it to ensure that, the user remains safe. Or at least, the very least, that user can say, hey, wait a minute, why am I getting a request to send a random payment in Coles Myer gift cards to a third party? This sounds a little fishy. So, educating the users on how to spot, bad activity is a really good start in getting them involved in cybersecurity, and the rest will come naturally once they've got a bit of knowledge. So, yeah, I strongly feel that cybersecurity is just not the IT department's anymore. It's everybody's responsibility.
Now, as we get towards the end of the interview, I always like to ask 3 questions. One is about the future. I should have looked online to see when the first ransomware attack happened. I don't know if it was 10 years ago or 15. I can't remember, but it would have been something like that, because before then, it was just sort of, I guess, the more regular viruses. But the question is, there was a time when we didn't have ransomware. Now it's everywhere. But in 2030, what do you think the threats might be by then? I mean, one of the questions I've spoken to security companies about is that, by then we might have these brain chips, be they wired or, implanted or wireless, and bad guys might try and figure out how to encrypt a brain chip and put you into sort of a virus ransomware coma as opposed to a medical coma. And I mean, that will be a very scary thing if that sort of transpires. But where do you think we'll be in 2030 with security?
Well, a couple of things. So I think the first piece of ransomware was back in the 80s, believe it or not. And it sort of took a bit of a snooze, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff between, then and what we see as ransomware today. Look, forecasting, 5 years into the future, let alone another 10 years into the future, that's kind of beyond my scope and my visibility. But if I was to speculate, and I love to speculate sometimes, I don't see those scenarios that you illustrated just then as being impossible. We've already had, situations where security researchers have been able to influence, a heart monitoring device that would be put into people that had, weak or poor hearts, to ensure that there was a constant, electronic rhythm. Being able to interrupt those signals and cause cardiac arrest, in a simulated sort of like setup, not actually in a real person. But it just goes to show that, if it's a piece of tech and it requires some sort of, remote, connectivity, either through, some sort of personal area network like Bluetooth or load transmitting energy style, or even Wi-Fi, there's going to be a requirement of security around it. And case in point, you look at the industrial control systems that are regulating some of our, coal burning power plants and solar arrays and even nuclear facilities in some other parts of the globe. They were using computing controls to help regulate, flow of water, flow of power. and they were compromised because they were connected to the internet without sort of much form of security around them. So it's already happened. The scenario has already been, I guess, theorized. And in another 10 years, I wouldn't sort of say that that was an impossibility. If we're dumping, chips into people's brains to help them, hear again and see again and even speak again or even move again
Or have
because of
super memories or other super, powers, as it were, that augment what humans can do. Yeah. I'm sure the children of the future, I've read about it before, they'll be begging their parents, I want to get this chip. Little Johnny's got it and he can remember everything that's ever said to him. And it's like, I prefer it to be wireless.
no wires, please. Yeah.
I mean, Elon Musk talks about the neural lace going into the brain, but I don't think he's going to be the first one to try it out. They'll get somebody who is somehow brain damaged or something that has got nothing to lose to want to try it. But
that's right. Medical trials. They've been doing that for decades now with different drugs and people that are willing to try them out and report on the side effects, if any, and the benefits, of course. But I'm sure we'll see the same volunteers in the future. Those that maybe can't walk and have a chip implanted in them that gives them the ability to walk again, to repair nerves or whatnot. I'm not a medical professional by any stretch of the imagination, but 10 years is a long time in the technical field. And looking at the evolution that we've seen in the last, 5 to 10 years, I'm kind of excited to see what comes in the future. I have no idea what cybersecurity will look like in 10 years' time. I've got an idea what it may entail. I still feel that we'll be using, computers. We'll be using a lot more AI, artificial intelligence to help, make decisions. But there's always going to be a human at the end of the chain to help, guide that result and ensure that businesses and information stay secure.
So my second last question is just simply to ask you, what is the best piece of advice or pieces of advice that you've received in life to help you get where you are today?
Yeah, I guess, I'm a little bit risk averse when it comes to most things in life. So I do really weigh up the outcomes of an action I'm about to undertake. So might be seen as a little bit slow sometimes to make a decision. Just ask my wife.
Slow but sure.
Slowly but surely. So I guess in the modern times, where a lot of people, and especially my own kids, I've watched grow up in the last, 7 and 9 years between the two of them, and they've really, adopted technology because they see mum and dad using it day in, day out, and to them, I look back when I was that age and I was like, I had a Commodore 64 and I was able to use it maybe a couple of times a week, but my daughter's using an A14 Bionic chip and an iPad Air, which is pretty cool and radical to see, right? Yeah. So my advice to anybody really that I talk to is, cybersecurity is something that we've all got to be aware of, and we've got to get the basics right. So things like strong passwords and multi-factor authentication everywhere. And if you are asked to update an application, do it. That's going to avoid a lot of the issues that people see in a cybersecurity sense. Yeah. But it's helped keep me secure and keep my family secure. And I'm sure there's other advice that I should be given that's the best thing I've got at the moment.
Sure. Well, and the only thing I'd say is, become street smart so that when you do see an update asking you to update something, look at it. Is it really an update? I mean, we all saw over the past few years those fake Flash updates or fake Windows updates that then put ransomware or something else on your computer. So just because it's asking you to update doesn't mean you should just drop everything and update. I mean, we've also had problems where updates have caused issues. I mean, I'm using Big Sur on my Mac, and I wouldn't call it Bug Sur, but there are a few bugs in it, right? I mean, generally speaking, it's been really good. But I mean, originally they were calling it the Big Surprise, but I think the big surprise is for anyone that uses TextEdit, for example, you sort of hit the delete key and it jumps back to the top. And I mean, I use TextEdit because it's so much quicker and easier than using Pages or Word. And, I've seen other people complain about that. And sometimes there's an update, you think, I want the update, but it can cause other problems. So I sort of have switched from saying update immediately to like, maybe you should wait a week or two or a month just to see. But certain other updates, like the update for the Camtasia software that I needed to record this video interview today. Yesterday it was working. Today it had some sort of bug and I had to put it on straight away. So you've got to be street smart about that. and I guess that comes from experience.
Yeah, I think that the summarization that we get, even from our vice president of sales, Mike Valentine over in the States, he's not a cybersecurity, I guess, technical person at all. Hi, Mike, if you're listening to this, but his catch cry is patch early and patch often, and it couldn't be more truer in this day and age. Is that if something needs to be updated, let's just assume an official update is released, is that it should be applied.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
yeah, and I get the whole thing of there's a lot of noise out there. Turning on your computer, there's a lot of pop-ups and things that scream at you to do things and do that. And you just want to do the things that you want to use the computer for. But, when VLC pops up, before you watch that movie and it's asking for an update it. If Microsoft Windows wants to reboot, at a convenient time to you, allow it to update, because that's going to reduce so much surface area for the attackers to take advantage of, that it's just going to force them to move on to another potential target and leave you alone. So patch early and patch often.
Yeah. So what is your final message to iTWire viewers and readers, and to your current and future customers and partners?
Yeah, I mean, and I wish I had hours to chat about the advice I'd like to give, but just to anybody out there that's got a computer in front of them and has an interest in using a computer for their business and in your own livelihood, is just to get the basics right. When choosing a password, make it unique. Make sure that you use a password manager. Please do. I mean, you can't remember last count I had 497 unique passwords of different services out there on the internet. There's no chance that I can remember all those, but I've got a fairly long, complex password that have got mnemonics in it that I can remember, and that's the one password that I use to unlock everything. And then that keeps me secure. So if a service is breached, my whole digital footprint isn't compromised. So get the basics right, get a password right, demand multi-factor authentication. Your bank, your Gmail, your Dropbox, your OneDrive, whatever you may use online, if it's a username and password service to authenticate, see if there's another factor of authentication. Facebook's got it. As I said, all those services previously, they all offer multi-factor authentication, but a lot of the times they're not on by default, so turn them on. And the last thing is just, patch early and patch often. They're probably the three core tenets of anything outside of a cybersecurity control that I would recommend. You get those basics done right, you're going to cut off a lot of the garbage. It's not going to block all of those really insistent hackers that are out there, but that's where security controls and companies like Sophos can come into play to help you out.
Sure. Well, look, I will have the report linked to in the article that this video is embedded in. But Aaron Bugal, Global Cyber Security Solutions Enabler at Sophos, thank you very much for your time, and I hope we can speak again in the future.
Thanks, Alex. It's been a pleasure, mate. Cheers.
Bye-bye.